Do you remember the first time you heard that opening fanfare? That wall of brass, that sweep of strings, and suddenly a Star Destroyer filled the screen from edge to edge. It was the summer of 1977, and something happened inside Canadian movie theaters that nobody had planned for, nobody had predicted, and nobody would ever quite forget. Lines stretched around city blocks in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Kids skipped summer jobs. Families drove hours from small towns. Theater owners called each other in disbelief. This was not just a movie opening. This was the moment Canadian cinema culture cracked open and something entirely new walked in. And tonight, we are going back to that summer. To understand what happened in the summer of 1977, you have to understand what going to the movies in Canada actually looked and felt like before it arrived. In the mid-70s, Canadian theaters were comfortable, familiar places, modest lobbies, the smell of popcorn, butter, and cigarette smoke drifting in from the sidewalk, double features on weekday afternoons, weekend crowds that filled maybe half the house on a good night. It was pleasant, it was routine, it was exactly what it had always been. Hollywood itself was in a restless, searching period. The films that had defined the early part of the decade were gritty and morally complicated. Network, Chinatown, The Godfather, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. These were serious, adult films, and Canadian audiences had embraced them. The disaster epic had also had its moment, with films like The Towering Inferno and Earthquake drawing crowds looking for spectacle. By early 1977, even that wave was receding. What remained was something quieter, more introspective, cinema that asked difficult questions and rarely offered clean answers. Theater owners across the country had settled into a predictable rhythm. Book the films, run the prints, count the receipts. Some weeks were stronger than others, but nothing suggested the ground was about to shift beneath them. None of those projectionists threading film on a Tuesday afternoon in April could have guessed what was coming. But before any Canadian theatre could run a single frame of it, the word was already moving north. Star Wars opened in the United States on May 25, 1977. It did not arrive in most Canadian cities until weeks later, rolling out market by market through late May, June, and into July. That gap, those few electric weeks between the American opening and the Canadian rollout, produced something that has almost no equivalent in the modern experience of film. Pure, unfiltered, human-powered anticipation. There was no internet. There were no trailers loading on your phone. There were no spoiler threads or reaction videos. What there was people. People who had driven to Buffalo or Detroit or Bellingham, crossed the border for a weekend, and come back fundamentally changed by what they had seen. And they could not stop talking about it. Kids returned to their schoolyards describing something they did not quite have the language for. There were robots, they said, and a giant furry creature, and spaceships that felt real, and something at the end that made the whole theater stand up. Their friends listened with the particular skepticism reserved for things that sound too good to be true. Canadian newspapers ran their first reviews within days of the American opening. Most of the critics reached for superlatives and still felt they were falling short. Words like extraordinary and overwhelming appeared again and again, which in the restrained vocabulary of 1977 film criticism meant something. The rumors were extraordinary. But when the film finally arrived on Canadian screens, the reality exceeded everything that had been promised. And then it arrived. Not with the coordinated machinery of a modern release, not with synchronized national premieres and red carpets and carefully managed media moments. It arrived the way most things arrived in 1977, quietly at first, and then all at once. Theatre owners across Canada had received their booking information weeks in advance. The expectations from distributors were modest. Fox had a science fiction picture, something unusual, something that had done well in the States. Book it, run it, see what happens. Nobody used words like historic. Nobody suggested they might want to order extra staff. Then the lines appeared. In Toronto, queues formed outside cinemas hours before the first evening showtime, stretching past neighbouring storefronts and curling around corners. In Montreal, the same scene played out in both French and English markets, families arriving in the early afternoon for a film that would not screen until nightfall. In Vancouver, in Calgary, in smaller cities and towns where a single theatre served the entire surrounding region, people came in numbers that nobody had accounted for. The summer heat made the waiting harder and somehow more memorable. People stood on sidewalks with their children, with their friends, with dates who had dressed up for the occasion. Some had driven an hour, some had driven more. Inside, projection booths ran the same 35mm print again and again, sometimes with barely enough time between screenings to clear the house and reset. Projectionists who were accustomed to quiet Tuesday evenings found themselves running 4 or 5 screenings a day. Theatre managers added midnight showings within the first week, a scheduling decision that was almost unheard of outside of major urban cinemas at the time. Still, people were turned away. Night after night, in city after city, for weeks. This was not an event that anyone had organized. There was no campaign behind it, no coordinated push, no influencer strategy. It was simply thousands of Canadians deciding, all at roughly the same moment, that they needed to see this thing for themselves. The crowds were remarkable. But who were those people standing in line, and what were they actually carrying into those darkened theatres with them? Look closely at those lines and you would see all of Canada standing in them. There were children who had grown up on science fiction comics and Saturday morning cartoons, for whom Star Wars was not a surprise but a confirmation. There were teenagers for whom it became an identity marker overnight, an instant shared language in every high school hallway from Halifax to Victoria. There were young adults who had trained themselves to distrust spectacle and who walked out 2 hours later quietly reconsidering everything. And there were skeptical fathers who arrived for the children's sake and found themselves leaning forward in their seats by the final act. In Quebec, families encountered La Guerre des Étoiles, the same story arriving through a different door with its own rhythms and resonances. In prairie cities, families made a full day of the journey. In maritime towns, it was the social event of the summer. What made it genuinely rare was that Star Wars did not sort people. It gathered Canadians across age, region, and language in a shared experience that few cultural moments ever achieve. And then it kept gathering them. People returned 2, 3, 5 times that summer, unwilling to let the experience end. What those audiences were experiencing inside the theatre was unlike anything Canadian screens had delivered before, and it changed what people believed a movie could be. To understand what happened to those audiences, you have to step inside the theatre with them. The lights went down, the fanfare hit, and even through standard mono speakers in a mid-70s Canadian cinema, John Williams' music arrived like a physical force, bypassing the thinking mind entirely and going straight to the chest. Then the Star Destroyer appeared. It entered from the top of the frame and kept coming, its scale establishing in 30 seconds, something that no description could have prepared anyone for. People who were there have said, consistently across decades, that their body responded before their mind did. What followed sustained that feeling for 2 hours. The color was warm and saturated. The emotional stakes were enormous and completely unambiguous. And crucially, none of it apologized for being exactly what it was. This was the contrast that mattered most. The cinema of the early 70s had trained audiences to distrust clean emotion, to hold feeling at arm's length as a mark of sophistication. Star Wars dissolved that training. It gave audiences permission to feel without reservation, to care absolutely, to be moved without embarrassment. It was not a naive film. It was a deeply skillful one, engineered to restore something that cynicism had quietly taken away. And in theaters across Canada that summer, audiences received that restoration, like something they had not known they were missing until the moment it arrived. The experience inside the theater was transformative, but the effects of Star Wars on Canadian culture extended far beyond those 2 hours in the dark. Within weeks of the Canadian rollout, its presence was visible in places that had nothing to do with cinema. Schoolyards had reorganized themselves around it. The conversations that had once been about hockey cards and summer plans were now about lightsabers and the Force, and which character you would rather be. Children who had seen it explained it in breathless detail to children who had not, and the children who had not went home and asked their parents to take them. Toy stores found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The licensing and merchandise wave that would eventually make Star Wars one of the most profitable commercial franchises in history had not yet caught up with the film itself. The toys were not on shelves. The action figures, the ships, the replica weapons, none of it had arrived. And so Canadian kids did what Canadian kids have always done when the world does not provide what they need. They improvised. Sticks became lightsabers, cardboard became spaceships. The imagination filled in everything the market had not yet thought to supply. Canadian newspapers that had already reviewed the film began running something different. Not criticism, but analysis. Feature writers trying to explain what was happening, why this particular film had landed with such force, what it said about audiences and about the moment. Radio programs picked up the same thread, debating whether Star Wars represented the future of popular cinema, or a spectacular but temporary departure from the serious filmmaking that had defined the decade. In Quebec, the conversation had its own particular shape. La Guerre des Étoiles had connected with French-speaking audiences in ways that surprised even those who had expected it to do well. Science fiction writers and artists across the country, people who had spent years working at the edges of popular culture, recognized that something had shifted in what the general public was willing to embrace, willing to feel, willing to take seriously. And Canadian theatre chains, who had initially booked the film with modest expectations, were now doing everything they could to hold on to it. Engagements that would normally run 2 or 3 weeks stretched into months. Some Canadian theatres ran Star Wars continuously into late 1977, It returned for engagements in 1978, drawing audiences who had already seen it and wanted to see it again, in a pattern of sustained demand that the exhibition business had almost no precedent for. The cultural wave was undeniable, but Star Wars also left a specific mark on the Canadian film industry and the business of moviegoing itself. For Canadian theatre owners and distributors, the summer of 1977 became a reference point they would return to for years. It was the before and after, the moment that separated the way things had always worked from the way things were now going to work. What Star Wars demonstrated, in terms that no business school case study could have made more clearly, was that a single film could sustain audience demand not for a weekend, not for 2 weeks, but for months, across every market simultaneously, from the largest urban cinemas to the smallest single-screen houses in mid-sized Canadian towns. This was not how the industry had thought about film. Releases came and went, prints moved from city to city, audiences showed up for the novelty and then moved on. Star Wars refused to follow that pattern, and the industry had to reckon with what that refusal meant. Booking expectations shifted almost immediately. Theatre owners who had grown accustomed to planning 4 to 6 weeks ahead found themselves trying to hold a single film for an entire season. Conversations began about screen capacity, about the limitations of existing infrastructure, about what it would mean if this kind of demand became not an exception but a standard. The pressure on subsequent summer releases was instant and considerable. Every major studio looked at what Fox had achieved and began asking how to replicate it. For Canadian exhibitors, that meant a new kind of negotiation, a new kind of competition for prints and screens, a new calendar built around the idea that summer was now a season with a dominant film at its center. But there was a tension underneath all of it that thoughtful people in the Canadian industry could not quite set aside. Star Wars was an American film made in America, financed by an American studio, telling an American mythology of heroism and frontier and individual destiny. It was thrilling, yes. It was also entirely, unmistakably American, and as blockbuster culture began to reshape what Canadian screens showed and what Canadian audiences expected, the questions about Canadian content, Canadian stories, and Canadian screen identity became harder to ignore. That tension between embracing the spectacle and questioning its origins would define Canadian cinema conversations for years to come. But in the summer of 1977, most people were not thinking about any of that. Most films fade. They have their moment, they earn their audience, and then they recede into the background of cultural life, becoming references rather than memories. Star Wars did not do that. Not for the generation of Canadians who were there in the summer of 1977. It stayed, and it stayed in a specific way that very few cultural experiences ever manage. People who were children or teenagers that summer can tell you, decades later, exactly where they saw it. Which theatre, which city, which seat. They can tell you who they went with, whether it was a parent, or a best friend, or a group of cousins piled into a station wagon for the drive into town. They can tell you what the lobby smelled like, what the weather was when they walked back out into the evening, how long it took before anyone said anything. That quality of precise, embodied memory belongs to only a handful of experiences in any life. The kind that divide personal history into the time before and the time after. Across Canada, that memory took different shapes. In Quebec, it lived in French, in the particular cadences of a dubbed performance that an entire generation grew up with as the definitive version. On the prairies, it carried the weight of the journey, the significance of an occasion that required planning and distance. In maritime towns, it was bound up with the social fabric of that summer, with who you were and who you were becoming. In the cities, it was layered into the texture of neighborhoods and theaters that in many cases no longer exist. For many Canadian children of the 70s, this was the first time they had been completely and consciously swept away by cinema. Not entertained, not distracted, swept away. It was the moment they understood in their bodies before their minds what film could do at its most powerful. That understanding did not leave them. Those children are grandparents now. And when that opening fanfare plays, something happens that has nothing to do with nostalgia as a comfortable or sentimental feeling. It is something sharper and more precise than that. It is the specific sensation of a summer evening in 1977, arriving without warning, as intact and immediate as the day it was made. And that is the thing about great shared moments. They do not belong to the studios, the distributors, or the theatre chains. They belong to the people who were there. We went back to that summer tonight, and it was exactly as remarkable as we remembered. Think about what it actually was. Not a marketing campaign, not a managed cultural moment. It was thousands of Canadians, from every province, every language, every walk of life, standing in lines they had not planned to stand in, for a film they could barely describe, because someone they trusted had looked them in the eye and said, "You have to see this." That is something no studio can manufacture. That is something that belongs entirely to the people who lived it. If you were there in one of those theatres, in one of those lines, on one of those summer evenings in 1977, We want to hear from you. Tell us which city. Tell us who you went with. Tell us what the walkout felt like. That memory is worth keeping, and it is worth sharing. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment below, share it with someone who was there, and subscribe so you never miss the next time we go back. We went back to the summer of 1977 tonight. And just like that fanfare, just like that first impossible glimpse of a Star Destroyer crossing the screen, it did not disappoint.